Raise the Wage Mississippi Forum. And so we're excited to have you all here tonight. We're going to have a great discussion around a national topic. And we have joining us tonight for our conversation, we have Dr. Lauren Long with Tougaloo College. Welcome. We have Megan Bennett Esquire with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Welcome. And we have Dr. Kyra Roby Esquire with One Voice. And so we're excited to have them with us tonight. Also, we want to take time to welcome Representative Zakiyah Summers. Welcome to the discussion.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Our chat is activated for tonight's discussion, so please make sure that you're chatting in any questions that you may have of the panel. Also, we want to remind you that we've kicked off our When They See Us Mississippi HBCU campaign, and we're excited about that. We started in January, and we will be running the campaign through May 31st of this year. And the goal is to support Mississippi HBCUs. So we have a ticker that will be displayed on the screen. It's running now, and you can use your phone and text HBCU to 53555, and you can donate to the Mississippi HBCU of your choice. And so go ahead now and get your device, take a few minutes and make your donation. We appreciate you. So our host or our moderator for tonight's discussion is Dr. Long. And so I am going to hand the mic over to her to get us started tonight. Dr. Long.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the ladies of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and especially the Social Action Committee for being community champions, helping to spread awareness around critical policy issues as such. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us on tonight. As stated, we have a panel of women with a wealth of knowledge and expertise that's going to share some information with you around the state of wages in Mississippi. So I truly believe tonight's discussion will help to raise awareness to get more people engaged in the issue. So increasing the federal and state minimum wage remains one of the top policy priority issues throughout the country. Since the federal government has failed to increase minimum wages, states have taken the initiative to raise their own wages to give workers more financial security while improving their economies. Addressing the state of wages in Mississippi is even more so important for our mission to our legislators, community leaders, members, and especially those who are directly impacted. And so we know that the federal minimum wage is currently $7.25, and we haven't seen an increase since 2009. We also know that in light of a global pandemic, it's important that we strengthen pay standards, especially for those to help low-income households. So on that note, we're going to jump right into our questions. Ladies, if you would respond to the questions in the order that you were introduced, that would be great. And so our first question on tonight is, when we think about the households that are impacted by low wages, what are some of the benefits of establishing a state minimum wage?
So I'll go first, since I was introduced first. So establishing a state minimum wage is important because the federal government minimum wage is the bare minimum. And if you are trying to help Mississippians, having a higher minimum wage than the bare minimum helps lift households that live below the poverty line or might be right at the poverty line. It helps lift them out of that income bracket. And so I'm thinking about the income tax debate that happened today in the Senate, where they were talking about putting more money in Mississippians' pockets, but raising the minimum wage just $1 above the federal minimum adds around $2,000 per year to a single worker's income, which is more than the income tax cut would provide for that same worker, assuming they're making $40,000 a year.
And Dr. Long, I know you mentioned, the $15 an hour minimum wage, and the last time that it was a raise on the federal level, and we know that if the minimum wage, given inflation and just the state of the economy right now, grew at the same pace of which it was enacted, that minimum wage actually be upwards of about $20, $22 an hour, I believe. And so when you think about raising the minimum wage and who that particular policy would benefit, you think about a few things. One is just the income gap that exists across the country and even in Mississippi. And so that we know that there is a large wealth gap and income gap between different households, and you can divide that gap between by race, by gender, by ethnicity, by all these different things. And so raising the minimum wage will, one, help reduce the inequities that we see in terms of pay to workers. I mentioned the race gap, and so there's a race equity problem in terms of income and wages throughout the country and in the state in general. We know that some of our work with the tax policy, we know that for white Mississippians, the average income for that group is about 72 or a little over $72,000. The average income for Black Mississippians is closer to $40,000. And so there's a racial component to the income gaps that we see. And certainly by increasing the minimum wage, we can see those gaps decrease, because unfortunately, a lot of the people that are represented in these lower wage jobs are disproportionately Black people, are disproportionately women, head of households. They are educated, a lot of times college educated Mississippians. And so we know that increasing the minimum wage will impact these individuals as well. And they'll also benefit, just when you look at the state as a whole, our economy in terms of economic growth and what we like to see in terms of a skilled workforce. So the Mississippi Economic Council just released a report even this past week saying that a skilled workforce is one of their top priorities for business leaders. And we hear a lot about economic growth in Mississippi and retaining like the brain drain that occurs within the state. And a lot of that does have to do with being able to have a livable wage and good benefits in some of the jobs that people have in the jobs in the state. And we see this not even on some of the lower income jobs. We see this in high income jobs too. Someone was just talking to me about the head of departments, the state agencies in the state. If they're being paid much lower than counterparts across the nation, how do we keep good candidates or good workers here in the state? And so we see this across the board, across income spectrums, across racial spectrums. But increasing the minimum wage that we see will have a benefit not only on people, but on communities and the economy as well.
Well, thank you so much for the question, and thank you to Delta Sigma Theta for inviting this finer woman to be a part of this forum. I see raising the minimum wage having many benefits. We know that when an employee is paid at a higher wage, they feel valued. And when you provide value to an employee, then they're going to feel good about their job. You're going to see employers being able to retain employees at a higher level. You're going to see turnover at a reduced level. And you'll also see productivity increase as well. So if I'm receiving pay that is equitable to what I'm providing to an employer, then I'm going to stay in my job a little bit longer. I'm going to make sure that I am producing and reaching the goals and objectives of my job. And therefore, the employer can know that I'm not a risky employee. A lot of times we hear opponents of minimum wage say that, this is going to be very detrimental to businesses. And that perspective really does not fall in line with their platform of being fiscally conservative. Because if you're raising minimum wage and you're providing more money to Mississippians, then that means that those Mississippians can then not have to receive government subsidies to provide for other services. Not totally, but those subsidies may be reduced. And so if the goal is to, lower the cost of governmental spending, then minimum wage is a solution for that effort. And so, as the other ladies on the panel have already said, I just want to reiterate that it would be a positive thing for Mississippians, regardless of what political party you're in, regardless of where you are on the spectrum. It helps to provide a healthier Mississippi. And we know that when people have more money, then it's likely that they're not going to be sick all the time. So they're healthy in that vein. And then they're also able to afford the things that they need for their quality of life.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, ladies. So, in terms of quality of life, let's think about living wages as compared to the minimum wage. So, according to recent studies, it would cost a family of one adult and two children an average of $32 an hour to make a living wage. Living wages are basically thriving wages, which means families would have funds to meet their needs while having a little disposable income as well. So, with this in mind, would the proposed minimum wage increase cover the basic cost of living in our state? And just for example, food and shelter.
Is there a particular order you want us to go in, or we just jump in?
If you want to just jump in, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, sure. So, so the quick answer to that question is no. Based on my research, a person would need to make at least $46,000 a year to have a comfortable lifestyle and be able to afford all the things that they need. And so we're talking about, a minimum wage, similarly to what Kyra mentioned in terms of relating that to inflation, at least $22 an hour. And we know that at least the narrative has been around raising it to $15 an hour. That doesn't meet that. And so there will still be a significant threshold for workers. And when we think about people that are making minimum wage, we're talking about inexperienced workers, typically workers that are just entering into the workforce, young people, that may be taking part-time jobs, summer jobs, things like that. And so for individuals that may have some experience or they've been in the workforce for quite some time, they're probably not entering at that $7.25 an hour level. But nonetheless, minimum wage has never taken into context the inflation. It's never accounted for inflation since minimum wage was first created in this country. And that in itself is problematic because we know that the price of everything is going up, but the wages are not meeting that level of increase. And so no, it wouldn't. And there would be a whole lot more work that would need to be done in order for that to happen.
Yeah, and I can add to that by saying, the truth is that nearly 1 in 4 Mississippians live below the federal poverty line. And according to a study that was released in 2021 by the United Way of Mississippi, it was called the ALICE report, which stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. Mississippians, we know another 30% of Mississippians cannot afford the basic household items that Representative Summers mentioned. So when you think about the rising cost of housing, the rising cost, increasing cost of childcare, the increased cost of food. I mean, if anybody's gone to the grocery store, like within the past, few months as compared to this time last year, we know that those prices have gone up and pretty much everybody's wages, I'm sure, has stayed the same. When you think about transportation and the cost of gas, the same thing. I mean, I don't fill up my car tank just because I just don't want to see it go above, a different number than what it was when I first bought my car. Or, healthcare. We're still dealing with the global health pandemic and the rising cost of healthcare as well. And so when you see wages staying stagnant, and when you think about in terms of like a livable wage, we know that pretty much everybody's experienced some kind of rising costs in these basic survival items that we haven't experienced previously. And so, of course, the minimum wage that's currently set at is not enough for that. And, even as Representative Summers alluded to, a $22 minimum wage, wouldn't do it either. And especially in a state like Mississippi that deals with persistent poverty, I think it's not something that we talk a lot about when we're discussing these policy issues, but we're starting from a place very different, from many other states. And we have to think about what it would take for us to get to the point where Mississippians can thrive in a livable wage with good benefits, especially relation to healthcare, especially right now that we have a long way to go in meeting that need.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that many people who live under the poverty line, the people that raising the minimum wage would help, tend to be families with children. And overwhelmingly, those tend to be single parent households with children. I, I used to be one of those households. I made minimum wage with 2 college degrees and, would wonder how I was going to buy groceries and pay my electric bill. And luckily, I qualified for SNAP benefits. But even with that assistance, I still wasn't able to afford childcare. When I moved to Jackson to come to law school, my mind was blown. I've been paying a family friend $100 a week to watch my son. I came to Jackson, $850 a month. And so there's also, it needs to be a holistic approach to help people move forward in Mississippi. Yes, we need to raise minimum wage. That is an amazingly huge first step, but we also need to look at expanded child care assistance. MLICI, the Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative, did an amazing report a few years ago with the National Women's Law Center called Mississippi is Shortchanging Women, that pointed out that white women in Mississippi, due to the wage gap, will lose about $400,000 over the course of their working lifetime, assuming 40 years. But if you were a Black woman in Mississippi, you're going to lose almost double that, a little under $800,000. And when you put it in numbers that big, I don't think that we can really continue to ignore this issue and say that, we'll get to it next year. And I think a lot of times there's so many things happening in the legislature that it's so easy to say, we got this one this year, we're going to put it on the back burner. We'll look at it next year because we have such a short, intense session. But I really think in light of the pandemic and so many families realizing that they really are only $400 away from a crisis, that providing that sort of security, financial security to Mississippians has to become one of our priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, ladies. So, just to piggyback off of that question, in terms of Mississippi's long history of income injustices and inequality, that persistent poverty that you mentioned, Kyra, we know that this road ahead is going to be tough. And we also know that we must continue to fight for increasing these wages. So, with that in mind, how do we move forward to secure a state minimum wage law, and how long will that take?
I will go first since I went last time. I would say, and this may not be a popular answer, I would say minimum 5 years. For from start to finish organizing a campaign like that, I don't see how it could take any less, especially given the incredibly, conservative supermajority that we have in Mississippi, who tend to like the pull yourself up by your bootstraps myth, which is a myth because you physically cannot pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and some people can't afford boots. And I just assumed that there was a minimum wage bill introduced this year. It got totally ignored. I don't even think they brought it up in committee, but I'm not 100% sure. I would say minimum 5 years.
And to piggyback off Megan said, it would take a holistic, or I guess two things. First, it would take a holistic approach, like Megan was mentioning. Even having, Mississippi 43 states have a state minimum wage. So Mississippi is one of the few that doesn't even have a state minimum wage. Our minimum wage is set at the federal minimum wage. And so that's one thing. We can do things like implementing a state minimum wage and starting there and working our way up, the scale to get to like a $15 minimum wage, which we already know isn't enough. So it takes a little bit of groundwork, to get to that point, and to, I don't want to say convince, but to convince some lawmakers that, this is something that's even needed, that is even a priority for people. We see that businesses have already recognized that. I mean, the pandemic did that for us. We see a lot of fast food chains, advertising $15 an hour. We see, national brands like Hobby Lobby and some Walmart, some of these Chick-fil-A, some of these other places recognizing the fact that we need to and can pay people more. And so I think, our state lawmakers could get there, but we really have to make that a priority. And then we have to make sure that we include some of these other policy measures as well, like ensuring that the state has an equal pay law and an equal pay law that supports women, like implementing maybe a child tax credit or earned income tax credit. So these tax credits that actually put money back into the hands of working families that support folks that are working, especially families with children, and Megan stated earlier. So there are some other things that we can do in addition to implementing and increasing the minimum wage just in Mississippi, and advocating, including the things that's going on the federal level around it. But we do need to see it as more of like a holistic approach to ensuring that every Mississippian, every person within the country has the same opportunities and opportunities that we need to survive, for basic survival skills.
So your question is really the $1 million question. What is it going to take? How long is it going to take? And, based on my experience as a legislator, and Megan mentioned about the majority, supermajority that we have right now, for legislation to get some traction, you got to have the will and the desire to want to pass legislation that is going to benefit not just the districts that happen to have the votes that represent the supermajority, but legislation that's going to benefit all Mississippians. And all Mississippians includes Black Mississippians, white Mississippians, other people of color, old and young, male and female, those that are living in poverty, and those who, may have funds to be able to do what they need to do. And so in order for us to get to the will and the desire that we need and the representation that we need people to vote. We have elections here in the state of Mississippi every year. We need sororities, fraternities, organizations, churches, everybody on the ground getting out into the community and encouraging people and educating people about the need for them to exercise their right to vote. If you exercise your right to vote and you don't sit at home and say, oh, my vote's not going to count, I'm not going to get involved. If you're doing what you need to do to exercise your civic responsibility, then you can elect individuals that will carry the message, that will bring the will and the desire into those spaces, into the state capitol, where we can get some things done. Now, unfortunately, the Supreme Court struck down our ballot initiative process, and we know that we had a ballot initiative for raising the minimum wage, which was one way, when we can't get it done at the state capitol, it is one avenue that the people can have to be able to make some type of policy impact. But since the Supreme Court struck that down because of the medical marijuana program, now it's up to the legislature to put something like that in place. And let me tell you something. What has been put on the table is not a true ballot referendum process. What is going through the process now would allow for the people to put a ballot referendum process only for general law, for statutes. So you would not have the ability to amend the Constitution. We've seen in states like, Kyra mentioned the number of states that have raised their minimum wage. In Arkansas, they were able to raise their minimum wage by ballot referendum. So they amended their constitution and phased in a minimum wage over 3 years that went from the federal minimum wage level to now $11. I have a colleague over there in Arkansas that runs the Department of Labor, and I spoke with him today about this very issue. And what he told me was that, contrary to what he thought would happen, it's actually been a very positive thing for the state of Arkansas. There have been no complaints from businesses. Prices have, increased a little bit, and we can expect that, that perhaps a little bit will be passed on to consumers. But it's helped employees and it's helped employers alike. And so we've seen where states have raised the minimum wage, and it has worked. It has not done all the horrible things that we typically hear from the opponents of it. And then we also got to get the business community engaged on this, because the business community has a huge lobbying effort. All right, they have a lobbying tool. And so if we can get the business community engaged on this and say, this is something that we would welcome if it's phased in, if it's done right, we would get behind it, and they will then speak to the legislators that can help carry the football across the goal line. So those are the things that I think will need to happen. Now, how long will that happen? As I said, we got elections next year. We're gonna be electing a new governor, a lieutenant governor, lawmakers, all the way down the line. And so this is an opportunity for us to hopefully increase the will and desire to do some of the things that we want to do.
Absolutely. Thank you, ladies, for that. And I do have one question, but I want to back up to this holistic approach, because there are some misconceptions around eliminating the state's income tax. So can we expound on how harmful it would be for working families, and kind of give it a relationship to wages? So expound on the state's income tax, eliminating the state's income tax, and how harmful it would be to families and its relationship to minimum wages.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to what Representative Summers had just talked about, is things coming up in the legislature that sounds good or that looks good, but when you kind of dig into it, it's not that great, and it doesn't really benefit the people. So the elimination of the state individual income tax and the talks around doing that is sort of the same. So some lawmakers are saying that if you eliminate the state individual income tax, you'll put more money back into the hands of working families. And to for good measure, in bills to eliminate the individual income tax, there's two, one on the House side and one in the Senate. Both plans include a reduction in the tax on groceries, which is something that would benefit families, something that we, talked about in terms of something that's been a rising cost for folks. And reductions to the tax on car tax and its effect on that. But when you really look into it, we see that if you eliminate the state individual income tax, which is a tax that brings in approximately $2 billion in revenue, we're wiping that out. And on the House side, they're doing that. And in order to make up for that revenue loss, they're increasing the state's sales tax rate, which would really tax everything else that we pay for and everything else that we're buying. And so all of these necessities that we're talking about would go up as well. And we really see an offset to the fact that even with the good tax proposals that are introduced, if we eliminate that important income tax, we see that overall Mississippians who earn $19,000 and below will actually see an increase in the amount of taxes that they pay to the state. Meanwhile, the state's wealthiest 1% of individuals or individuals making over $975,000 will actually save about $30,000 a year. On the Senate side, they don't seek to eliminate the full income tax, but they want to eliminate a portion of it or cut a portion of it. And we see the same thing, that is a tax cut that will benefit the wealthy, and that families and others will be harmed by the tax cut, including services. So when I mentioned that the tax brings in $2 billion of revenue, this is money that goes towards education, public school, K-12, college, universities. This is money that goes towards roads and bridges, goes towards healthcare, goes towards criminal justice. And so if the state eliminates that amount of money, we will see most likely more likely than not, and almost definitively a reduction in the amount of money that goes to services in Mississippi that are already struggling. And these are services and programs that benefit working families and that benefit the people that we're talking about, that we need to increase their wages. And we see a detrimental a ripple effect. We see that communities would suffer because of the reduction in tax revenue that goes towards them, because of the grocery tax revenue and the car tax revenue. So we see that communities, local governments will be harmed by the elimination of individual income tax. So when we think of, like, again, that holistic approach in terms of what policies in Mississippi are needed to help working families, to create economic mobility and opportunity for people, eliminating income tax is one of those things that will not do that. And we see harm from both bills in terms of how much money will come into the state and about what Mississippians are impacted. And a lot of times, more likely in all of these different policy areas, we see the same folks impacted negatively. We see rural Mississippians harmed. We see Black Mississippians harmed. The women-led households being harmed. Senior communities being harmed. And these are the same people, again, that are impacted by not having a livable wage and good job and good benefits. And so we don't want to see more harm done to Mississippians from tax policies, especially, but any of these policies that we're talking about that we want to see the impact of corrected through the legislative process. So we just want to make sure that everyone kind of knows about that and can kind of sift through some of the arguments that's being made about how great this is, because we know that it's not, and we know that it's bad. The business community has said that it's bad. Education communities have said that it's bad. Legislators trying to increase teacher pay. Again, when we talk about livable wages, the wages paid to teachers and state employees are a big discussion in the legislature right now. And so we know that all of these folks will be harmed. And again, roads and bridges, infrastructure, all of that. And so we want to make sure that we understand kind of the full breadth of what goes on or what's going on in the legislature, and see how all of these policies and these priorities specifically are intertwined, and make sure that we don't really live in a vacuum in the legislative process, and these policies aren't a vacuum as well. And so they're all really interconnected. And so we want to make sure that we lift up the good stuff and that we fight against the bad stuff and make sure that our priorities are being heard.
So I have a question. When we consider the fact that there are 42 states that do have a minimum wage, I'm wondering what is being done or looked at from a federal perspective. The federal minimum wage has not been raised in a number of years. So I'm assuming then you have states that have taken the issue into their own hands to try to help their citizens. So why haven't we seen action from the federal government on this important issue?
I can try to answer that. I think maybe for the same reason we don't see on the state level. I think a lot of these things are about priorities. That it's easy to pass laws that are catered towards certain communities, but when we're really talking about helping people, we have to fight so hard to kind of get those arguments heard. And we see that even in federal legislation, that there may be calls or supports to do that. But ultimately, it gets stalled out. Build Back Better is an example of that, something that was a positive bill that would have helped millions of Americans, and it stalled out in Congress for political reasons. And we see that, a lot of times on bills that directly help people. And like you mentioned, states have taken that into their own hands. We see cities doing that as well. So even in places where a city or a state may have a certain minimum wage, a city could come in and create its own minimum wage that's higher than the state level or the federal level. And so there are opportunities to create a minimum wage or a livable wage outside of the federal government, even outside of the state government. But again, it's about people's voices people expressing their views and concerns through the legislative process, and making sure that they hold their elected officials accountable about what their priorities are and about what they want to see. So I don't know if that directly answered your question about what's going on, but I think it just kind of leads to some of the political arguments. And as Representative Summers said, you hear a lot against it, but when it's actually implemented, we see like even the business community has some broad support for a policy like this.
Thank you.
And I do want to piggyback off of what Kyra said. So actually, at the beginning of this year, the Office of Personnel Management for the federal government released a mandate that all federal government employees, contract employees, have to make a minimum of $15 an hour. A lot of times that will signal that within the federal government, they're exploring introducing legislation on this so that then the Office of Budget and Management can study it and see what the effects are. And I think Kyra's point about this being a political issue is, I mean, perfectly perfect. We just elected a new president, midterms are coming up. Federal Congress tends to shy away from big change-making gestures right before midterms, for better or for worse. But I think with the way the country has been moving forward over the last several years, I'm really hopeful that by the end of 2024, we will see a federal $15 minimum wage, because I think the federal government and the Biden administration is starting to realize that, leaving it to the states, which is the argument that the Mississippi Center for Public Policy makes we should do, is not helping. It's hurting Americans. So I'm really hopeful for that. But as people within my organization will tell you, I'm often very optimistic. So.
Awesome. Go ahead, Representative.
Yeah, I'll just chime in briefly. We know that the federal minimum wage was a part of President Biden's agenda. But we are literally on that threshold of, not having the votes that we need to pass progressive policy. In the same way, with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and Kyra mentioned the Build Back Better plan. We don't have, and in politics, you need the votes. It's all about the votes. If you don't have the votes, then you're not going to get done what you need to get done. And I think that, particularly with this issue with Russia and just so many other things that are looming, that the federal minimum wage, raising that has not been prioritized, as Kyra mentioned. And I wanted to also speak to the question around the income tax elimination. We heard testimony today from our state economist that essentially said that over a period of time, if one of these proposals passes, and he gave us a lot of different model projections, that we're going to see a decrease in employment. And a decrease in employment is a decrease in employment, either way you look at it. And when you have a decrease in employment, that means that public agencies are not going to have enough people to provide services that Mississippians need. And so if we don't have enough individuals to work in those jobs, that means that services are going to be reduced. And there are all the services that Kyra mentioned: public education, healthcare, infrastructure. All of these things are going to be directly impacted if one of these proposals makes it into law. And so I asked the economists, what is the alternative? What are some of the recommendations that you would provide to us that we need to be looking at in order to ensure that we have a healthy Mississippi? And you know what he said? He said, we should be investing in education. We should be investing in infrastructure. We should be investing in healthcare. Well, it's very hard to do that if we don't have the money to be able to do that. And what the income tax elimination plan would do, it would decrease our revenue by almost $2 billion. It'd be very hard to make up that $2 billion gap. Even with the increase in sales tax, it would take, a number of years. So, what can we do, Delta's Social Action Committee? We need you to know who your legislators are. We need you to develop those relationships, make phone calls, send emails, ask them for a cup of coffee, come up to the Capitol, in your crimson and your cream, and let them know that you want them to vote no against this bill. The Senate passed its version. It is now on the House calendar. I expect that we could even vote on it tomorrow. It will. It may go to conference because there are two different versions of how they want to do it, and the leadership, they're at odds with each other in terms of how the income tax should be eliminated. So this is an opportunity now to make your voices heard and let the lawmakers know that this is not good for Mississippi, and here are all the reasons why we want them to vote against this proposal.
Very powerful. Thank you, ladies. So backing up, let's back up here because we talked a little bit about business engagement. So in terms of, let's see. That's my question. Okay. So in terms of increasing the state's minimum wage, a lot of businesses fear that they will lose employees or even fear that they will close or, that their business will shut down. How can we speak to, or can we speak to rather, the effects on businesses in terms of increasing the minimum wage? Are there any positive effects that will trump any negative effects of businesses when it comes to increasing the minimum wage?
So I'll kick it off. And I prefaced our conversation with a few of those benefits, but I think what would be probably the greatest selling point is to have those businesses in states that have experienced a raising of the minimum wage and have them share their stories to other businesses in the state of Mississippi to show them that it's not as bad as you may think it is. And here's the data to back up, why it was actually a positive thing for us. As I stated earlier, Arkansas has been able to do it. There hasn't been, a huge issue, at least not from the Department of Labor director, in terms of businesses having complaints about it hurting their business. Now there may be some impact, there may be some marginal changes, that can be expected, but overall, what we end up doing, and it's what both of the other ladies have already talked about, is making sure that people are able to make money so that they can take care of their families, ensuring that productivity is increased, ensuring that retention increases and turnover decreases. All of those things end up helping the business community. The Mississippi Economic Council released last week, I think, in saying that the biggest issue with the business economy was meeting workforce demands. Well, we can meet workforce demands if we're paying people what they're worth. Folks are not going to just be, so excited and adamant about working a job and they're not making the money that they need and therefore don't feel valued in that job. So if we want to meet workforce demands, then we have to pay people what they deserve.
So I have a comment because I think we mentioned earlier about companies needing or being in a position of lobbying our legislature. And when you talk about lobbying, you typically would have to explain what's in it for the companies. And so I'm asking you ladies tonight, what benefits would companies find for supporting increasing the minimum wage that would benefit them?
I would argue that they would have workers. I don't know about y'all. My son loves Wendy's, and a couple of the Wendy's around here in the area, like you'll see signs, they'll say, they've decreased hours due to a worker shortage, and you'll see signs of now hiring, $15 an hour plus a sign-on bonus. Like, we didn't see that before the pandemic. And I think, the experiences of families during the pandemic where the federal government was able to provide cash assistance and folks saw like how like money in their pocket actually like impacted their life, and saw that some of these minimum wage jobs just like weren't worth it. And I remember that when the governor canceled unemployment benefits way earlier than most states, that the argument for doing so was to get people back to work, and that people were relying on this extra $300 from the government to just not have a job, for months or a year. And we were saying, no, like, you got to pay people. Like, people have been sick. They have to be caretakers for, their children, for family members, for themselves. They've seen what an extra $100, will do to their pocketbooks, to their families, to their livelihoods, and people are demanding that they are paid more. And we see still the effects of that in terms of worker shortages, even at your favorite restaurants. And I don't want to diminish the fight for livable wages just so restaurants and just so my son can have french fries and I have to cook for dinner. But I think that's just like a real world example of some of the impacts. And so what do businesses gain by that? I think they gain employees, and they gain workers who I don't know about enjoy coming to work, but at least show up and get the job done. And we've seen federally where companies have taken on the $15 minimum wage. So I looked it up: Amazon, Whole Foods, Target, Walmart, Wayfair, Costco, Hobby Lobby, Best Buy, Starbucks. All of these places, Centers and Farms in Mississippi, have increased pay to $15 an hour. And I think, as Representative Summers talked about, if you see the policy in action, then you wouldn't see some of the pushback that's being told before it's even acted or implemented. And there's a large body of research that supports the increase in minimum wage and the impacts of that. Like, it's a lot of research that's been saying it, and it's been saying it for years. And so I think, as far as businesses, you just got to do it. I mean, we see, when we think about taxes, we see where businesses and large corporations enjoy these great tax breaks from the government, even in Mississippi, with the expectation that they would bring like a certain amount of jobs to Mississippi, and that they would provide X, Y, and Z benefits to the state. And we don't see the realization of that. And so, yeah, the business community can lobby, but we see, in the power of people being able to, in terms of their support for certain businesses or their non-support for them, we see where there's power, not only within the business community, but then with people in general, just to say what they are and not willing to work for, and what policies they want to see changed.
Thank you.
And I will say something that I feel like definitely Dr. Long has heard me say before, but it's about supply and demand, right? You can't say that you understand supply and demand when it comes to gas prices, but that you don't understand it when you can't find workers. But if you're only offering $8 an hour and you don't want to increase it, then you do understand supply and demand. You are not supplying enough wages to satisfy that person's demand for wages. And conversely, not paying people a livable wage, which I don't think that any of us here could argue that business owners or corporations today don't understand that $7.25 is not a living wage at all, is labor exploitation. Labor exploitation is the existence of an unjust relationship based on an unequal exchange between employer and worker. And so I think that something really interesting that has come out of the pandemic is a lot of worker solidarity. And I am very energized to see where that takes us in the fight for progressive policies in Mississippi and in the country. Because, I do not live a life where I am scraping together pennies to pay my electric bill anymore. That is not all on my own. I had family assistance. And so when people are like, oh, she pulled herself up by her bootstraps. No, my family bought those boots, and saying that people should find a way out of their circumstance with no helping hands, no higher livable wage. no universal pre-K, whatever you decide the fight you want to fight is just another form of exploitation. We have to take care of each other. A business's function is not to take care of its workers. A business's function is to make profit. And I fully understand that. And that's great, amazing. Like, send me your small businesses. I want to see what you make, or do. But you have to take care of the people who are facilitating the existence of that business. If you are not coming into your business relationship knowing that you have to care for your workers, then your business, I think, will ultimately not be successful.
Thank you for that. And I do know that most businesses, they have a cost of doing business, and some of that would include their human resources. And so a lot of times when there's talk of increasing wages, then there's, I think, a subliminal fear that doing so will impact either the number of employees that you're able to hire or the amount of output of product and our services that you're able to provide to your constituents, the people who buy your products or use your services. And so understanding that and the impact on the minimum wage, I think, is really key.
And let me just add another layer to that, because, the relationship between the state and women, or the state and people of color, particularly Black people, has been very poor historically. Mississippi has been able to capitalize off of slave labor and cheap labor for hundreds of years, right? And so, that is also reflective in representation. If you look at the makeup of the legislature, we don't have a high number of women in those seats, nor do we have, a high number of people of color. We have, the Black Caucus, of course, but we're talking about majority white men that are sitting in those seats that are, making these policies or perpetuating the idea that we should not be doing what we need to do, as Megan said, to ensure that we're facilitating those services where people can earn what they need. And so, this also speaks to, the need for people to run for office. We need folks to run for office so that we can have good representation, so that we can improve the relationship between the state and her people. So I just wanted to add another layer to that conversation, that topic.
Thank you, Representative Summers. I think we have time for a couple more questions. So our minimum wage, we all know, is $7.25, the federal minimum wage. So the living wage is at around $30, but the poverty wage in the state of Mississippi, and this is according to Oxfam, it's a research engine, the poverty wage in the state of Mississippi is around $11. So that means anyone who makes this amount or less is automatically assumed to be living in poverty. So while thinking about that, let's take into consideration generational poverty, relative poverty, which means they're working, they're just not making enough. Mississippi just doesn't pay enough. And then we also want to take into consideration situational poverty in light of COVID, right? Everything that happened, the workers that were impacted, workers lost their jobs, workers were forced to file for unemployment benefits. With all of this in mind, how would increasing the minimum wage in the state of Mississippi impact the number of people in poverty?
So increasing the minimum, like you just said, anything under $11 is a poverty wage. Of the states who've enacted their own equal pay law, only 4 of those are in the South, and I'm counting Missouri, which most people don't. And as Representative Summers said, Arkansas increased theirs to $11. It was a step system over a period of years, totally doable, especially for Mississippi. We've copied them in other policies like rural broadband expansion that have been successful. So I definitely think that's a great tactic to use. But as Kyra said, 1 in 4 households in Mississippi lives below the poverty line. And it's not just the people who are earning the wages in the household who are affected. If you're a child living in a household that's living under the poverty line, the likelihood that you are food insecure goes up dramatically. If you're a child living in a food insecure household and not able to meet your nutritional needs, your brain development is going to be slowed. Your grades may suffer. If you are in that household and you're the generation above, you're a grandparent, maybe you need to stop working because childcare is too costly for the main breadwinner of that house. These ripple effects that happen from forcing people to live in poverty because you don't want to raise the minimum wage or whatever your reasoning is. I don't presume to know what people are thinking most of the time. It's really quite unfathomable once you think of the ripple effects. And so raising the minimum wage, taking that first step, is just the first step. This does not have to solve all of our problems. It just can be the first step to moving Mississippi forward.
So we thank you all for this conversation. I think we've all learned a lot tonight. And so I want to give our panelists an opportunity to say any last words that you want us to hold and take as we leave this conversation tonight about a state minimum wage.
I'll go first. Let's just continue the conversation. Let's not let these things die. Let's figure out a way to get more of the people that's impacted involved. Get them involved with the legislator. Have the people that are impacted tell their stories because it's real life, and I believe our legislators need to know that. Outside of that, piggybacking off of Representative Summers, people need to vote, and that's just the bottom line. We can't make a positive or effective change for the state of Mississippi if we're not voting for people who are in support of these policies. And I'll digress and let one of the other panelists speak.
Well, I want to thank you all so much again for the opportunity to be with you this evening and talk about this important topic. If Mississippi is really interested in ensuring that workers, families, and businesses prosper, then we must invest in the people. And one of the policies that we can do that is by raising the minimum wage. Another policy that Kyra likes to talk about is an earned income tax credit. I mean, there are so many other proposals that we could put into play that would ensure that Mississippi is moving in the right direction. I introduced a minimum wage bill. Several of my other colleagues have as well. They never make it out of committee. And that should say something to us. We need folks that are going to be at that table that will be willing to at least have the conversation and be willing to, let that bill come out of committee so that we can debate it on the floor. I do want to show some love to Senator Horn, who is the chairman of Labor on the Senate side. He did host a hearing on this very issue and was able to receive a lot of information about why we should increase the minimum wage. So, as you said, Dr. Long, we have to continue the conversation. We have to continue to educate folks about the importance of raising the minimum wage. And then we have to fight for that resolution for the state of Mississippi. So thanks again. And I hope everybody is well and safe. Please count me in on anything else that you all are doing. And thanks to the ladies that were also on the panel tonight. And thank you to Kia for inviting me as well. Thank you.
I just want to say it was so great to be on this panel. Thank y'all for this wonderful discussion. If y'all want to keep up with what SPLC is doing in the lobbying policy sphere, we're at splcactionfund.org. And I think that Fannie Lou Hamer said it best in 1964, you can pray until you're faint, but if you don't get up and do something, nothing's going to get done.
Exactly.
Yeah, and to echo what Megan said, like power is really in the hands of people. And I think sometimes as a collective of Mississippi, we forget that. Yes, we have a lot that we have to fight for. And yes, we are coming from farther behind than what we want to. But there's so much power in the hands of people. And so civic engagement is a must. Yeah, we have to vote. And then after that, we still have work to do. We still have to talk to our legislatures, as Representative Summers have said. We have to make our voices heard. And you can, start by doing that by joining or getting, Megan talked about the SPLC Action Fund. You can visit One Voice's website, onevoicems.org. We host a civic engagement roundtable where we talk a lot about these different issues. Thanks to my sorors for bringing these types of issues to light. But there are definitely so many different ways to get engaged and get involved in these policies that we want to see, and to make sure that we know that that we express what our priorities are. And I to fail to bring up the tax stuff again, that's just kind of where my head has been for a while. We saw last year where the business community came together and they said that they didn't want to see an increase in some of these sales taxes, and that was not in the tax bills this year. There are things that we can do as a collective to maybe move the needle or at least get things started so that we put ourselves on a path to some of these policies and priorities being put out. We didn't talk about American Rescue Plan money, but the state is sitting on $1.8 billion in federal money. Our cities and counties have money too. Like, where is that money going? And we have to continue to push the need for investments, push the need of people-centered policies. And there's a lot of ways to get to where we want to be. The minimum wage is one of them. And so we have to make sure that we're engaged civically to ensure, even after the votes are cast, that we are continuing to do the work within the legislature and outside to make sure our voices are heard.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies. One last question, real quick, y'all. How do y'all think Mississippi can have that relationship that we so long for with our citizens? Do y'all believe this is the representation that we speak of?
Most definitely, most definitely. If you are not, if you don't have a seat at the policy table, then you are going to be ignored. And the way that we get a seat to the table is by voting. And as Kyra said, it doesn't just stop there. And I tell you, we end up losing a whole lot when we don't vote. So if we don't agree or we don't like the things that are happening, we can't talk about those things if we haven't done our due diligence in making impact. And so we have to make sure we're registered to vote. We have to make sure that we go out and vote. And then after we vote, we have to remain civically engaged. And SPLC, One Voice, and many other organizations across the state do an amazing job to continue to engage and educate people about certain issues. And so those resources are absolutely free. You don't have to pay for them. And so, I know those organizations, and I do as well. I welcome the opportunity to come into your communities, to come into your churches, to come into your neighborhood associations and talk about these issues, because the more that we're educated, the more that we can then be empowered so that when we go out and cast our vote, we're making an informed decision. But it definitely starts with doing what we need to do so that we can have representation that can then carry the message, or, like I said, carry the football across the goal line. So that we can win, because ultimately we all want to win. And we know that when we prioritize racial equity and when we prioritize gender equity, not only do those groups win, but everybody wins, because everybody benefits from equity.
And I mean, like Representative Summers said, and I'm sure all of y'all know, our legislature is overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. I would love to see that change on both counts. And if you have ever considered running for office, you don't have to take a swing at the legislature right off the bat. You can start at school board or election commissioner, or what have you, and see if you like it. There are organizations out there that can help you build a campaign, learn how to fundraise, whatever. And if you think that that might be something you're interested in, feel free to shoot me an email. But we have seen what a difference having representatives like Representative Summers in the legislature can do. Having those voices at the table is so important, and listening to the communities that these policies are supposed to be helping is vital. I feel like for a long time in Mississippi, we had a storied tradition of people from the Northeast and West Coast coming here and saying, well, y'all are so backwards, here's what you should do, and ignoring the communities that said, well, that won't work here. We're not going to get that passed, or that's not going to be able to be done. And they're like, well, if you just weren't so backwards, you would be able to do it. Instead of saying, well, hey, how can we make this work for y'all? How we are here to help, not to be right. And a lot of times that tends to be the sticking point. You have to learn that you don't have to be right to help people. You just have to help people.
Well, all right, ladies. Do you all have any final words? No? All right. Well, I thank you to the ladies again of Delta Sigma Theta and to the Social Action Committee. And I will pass it back over to Miss Melinda.
Well, ladies, we've really enjoyed you all tonight, and we thank you for educating us and helping us to understand not only the issue, but the impact, because that's important. And so I think we'll leave this forum tonight challenged to do more, to find ways to join our hands with others to make a difference. And I want to give a quick announcement. We want to encourage the sorors of Delta Sigma Theta that Friday, February the 25th is the last day to register for Delta Days at the state capitol. And so we want our voices to be heard. And so go ahead and get registered so that we can impact as Sora, Sora Kyra, I think that you have advocated that we get our boots on the ground. And so we want to make sure that we're doing that. Also, we want to make sure that you don't forget to show your support for the When They See Us campaign for Mississippi HBCUs. And we'll continue this chat maybe on another day in another forum, but we are going to wrap up here tonight, and we look forward to other conversations in the future. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.